What happens when a petty HOA president cuts a man's power to prove a point? In a town ruled by fear and control, one man's act of defiance sparks a revolution that will change everything. Watch how Driftwood Shores lights up with power, freedom, and a newfound sense of community. Let's begin the story. The night the power failed in Driftwood Shores, it wasn't because of a storm or overloaded grid, it was because of pure, blistering pettiness. In the dead heat of a record-breaking summer, while even the ocean breeze felt like a hairdryer against the skin, Karen, the infamous HOA president of Driftwood Shores, crept across Nolan Reed's backyard like a cartoon villain. Armed with a stolen pair of industrial bolt cutters and wearing a ridiculous neon visor to blend in with the night, she snipped through the thick, heavily insulated power cable feeding Nolan's private backup energy system. Sparks briefly lit up the darkness, followed by a sharp crack and the silent death of power to Nolan's fortified cottage. Karen's motive: the same idiotic obsession she had nurtured for years, neighborhood aesthetics. Nolan's sleek black solar array and discreet backup generator, tucked behind a hand-built privacy fence, had apparently been deemed an eyesore by Karen alone. She had filed complaints. She had thrown tantrums at home meetings. And now, under the cover of night, she declared herself judge, jury, and executioner of Nolan's energy independence. What she didn't realize, standing there in her flip-flops and seaside vibes-only t-shirt, was that she hadn't just cut a wire, she had declared all-out war. 3 hours before the sabotage, Nolan had been lounging in his living room, enjoying the cool oasis his generator and solar bank provided. The news blared warnings about the aging coastal grid likely buckling under record demand. Officials begged citizens to stay cool, stay hydrated, and prepare for possible multi-day blackouts. Nolan had prepared for this exact moment. His cottage was a fortress of self-reliance. Solar panels soaked up the sun all day, a battery array larger than a golf cart hummed quietly in his shed, and his backup generator sat on standby. He was ready for whatever nature or incompetence threw his way. Except, of course, for the saboteur lurking right outside his window. When the lights flickered and died, when the ceiling fans shuddered to a halt, and the blessed hum of the air conditioning fell into a dead silence, Nolan bolted upright, adrenaline surging through his veins. At first, he thought it was a system failure, but a glance at his breaker panel and a quick check of the generator feed told him otherwise. Something was wrong, very wrong. Fighting the rising heat and panic, Nolan pulled up his outdoor security feed on his tablet, and there she was. The grainy footage showed Karen, grinning with manic triumph, waving the bolt cutters like a trophy before scurrying back through the dunes to her candy-colored Victorian house 2 streets over. At that moment, Nolan's pulse slowed, his breathing steadied. A cold, calculating rage settled over him like a second skin. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown. And if Karen thought she could force Nolan to kneel by plunging him into darkness, she was about to discover how catastrophically she had underestimated him. The battle for Driftwood Shores had just begun. Standing in the growing, suffocating heat of his powerless cottage, Nolan Reed stared at the blackened screen of his home control panel, feeling the sweat bead on his forehead and a bitter, sharp-edged smile pulled at his lips. If Karen thought she had won by snipping a single cable, she was in for the cruelest kind of awakening. He wasn't going to just fix the line quietly and move on. No, that would be letting her think she had power over him. Nolan wasn't just going to survive the blackout, he was going to orchestrate her isolation in front of the entire community. In his garage, tucked behind the kayak racks and battered surfboards, Nolan had a secret. Months earlier, as a side project, he had begun designing a mini private grid, a system of wireless relays and battery packs capable of sharing power across several neighboring homes in case of a disaster. It had been just a hobby, a what-if born out of too many hurricane seasons and too little faith in the city's ancient power infrastructure. Now, it would be his weapon. He grabbed his tool bag, wiped the sweat from his brow, and started moving with surgical efficiency. By flashlight, he disconnected his main feed from the severed cable and rerouted it through a series of junction boxes hidden along his fence line. He activated the wireless relay's miniature marvels of engineering one by one. Within minutes, his auxiliary grid hummed back to life. But this time, it wasn't just his cottage that flickered back into brightness. One by one, the neighboring houses began to glow, to porch lights igniting like fireflies, air conditioners roaring back to life, TVs flickering on inside living rooms. Every house, that is, except Karen's. Her grand old Victorian, painted in violently clashing shades of mint and coral, stood in darkness, an abandoned relic amid the returning life of Driftwood Shores. Nolan stood in the middle of his living room, bathed in the soft glow of renewed power, and watched the transformation unfold through his window. The neighbors, bewildered but thrilled, stepped out onto their porches. Confused laughter rang down the street. Windows swung open. Music floated into the sticky night air. Children who had been sweltering inside came bursting out to play with glow sticks and flashlights. Relief was palpable, visible, and infectious. Across the street, old Mr. Templeton cranked open his garage and pulled out a battered lawn chair, setting it right in the center of his driveway with a loud sigh of satisfaction. He lifted a can of beer high in Nolan's direction in a wordless, grateful salute. And there, barely visible in the shadows beyond the boardwalk, stood Karen. Her outline was a stiff, furious silhouette against the dim background, her fists clenched, her visor askew, her body practically vibrating with rage. Even from a distance, Nolan could see the moment realization dawned when she understood she hadn't plunged Nolan into darkness. She had isolated herself. Nolan didn't wave. He didn't smirk. He simply stood there, arms crossed, watching Karen stew in the lonely black void she had created. The first blow had been struck, and the war for Driftwood Shores was far from over. Morning in Driftwood Shores arrived like the slap of a hot, wet towel. The humidity was so thick it clung to the skin like syrup, and by 8 a.m., the temperature was already hurtling past 90 degrees. Yet for most of the street, the day began in cool, blissful comfort. Air conditioners buzzed, coffee brewed, children shrieked with laughter as they ran through sprinklers. A neighborhood once resigned to endless HOA harassment was, for the first time in years, alive with easy, joyful chaos. All except for one house, Karen's. Nolan watched from his front porch, sipping iced coffee, as Karen stumbled out of her house, looking like a character in a post-apocalyptic movie. Her pastel sundress clung to her with sweat, her usually immaculate hair frizzed in wild defiance of her expensive salon treatments. She carried a flashlight in broad daylight and swung it around angrily, as if blaming it for her misfortune. She scanned the street and saw it, lights gleaming from windows, garage doors yawning open, sprinklers spraying misty rainbows across green lawns. The entire block pulsed with energy and life. Except her, the oppressive heat radiated from the black shingles of her roof like waves off a desert highway. Karen stormed down the sidewalk, her flip-flops slapping against the concrete. She pounded on Mrs. Henderson's door, the neighbor next to Nolan. When the door swung open, Karen barked accusations, her voice carrying across the street. "You're in violation. Unauthorized power usage. This is illegal. I demand you shut it off." Mrs. Henderson, a sweet widow who had spent most of her time gardening until Karen fined her for unauthorized rose bushes, simply smiled serenely and said, "It's none of your business, Karen," before closing the door in her face. Karen pivoted furiously and marched to Mr. Templeton's driveway. The old man, reclining in his chair, gave her a lazy two-fingered salute without even removing his sunglasses. When Karen launched into a shrieking tirade about code violations and emergency meetings, Mr. Templeton slowly turned up the volume on his ancient boombox, drowning her out with 80s rock ballads. One by one, house by house, Karen found no allies, no sympathy, no authority. The power she had once wielded like a club was slipping through her fingers like dry sand. Nolan leaned back against the porch post, feeling the cold condensation drip from his coffee cup onto his hand. It was a small, beautiful reminder that he was no longer sweating under Karen's thumb. The true beauty of the moment wasn't just Karen's rage, it was the community's silent, smiling rebellion. No one argued. No one fought. They simply ignored her, basking in the power both literal and symbolic that Nolan had helped restore. By mid-morning, Karen's desperate frustration boiled over. She dragged a pair of long orange extension cords from her garage, stringing them frantically across her dead, sweltering yard toward her neighbor's outdoor outlets. Her plan was clear. If she couldn't have power legitimately, she would steal it. But Driftwood Shores was done playing by her rules. And Nolan, quietly preparing his next move from the cool sanctuary of his porch, knew Karen's worst day was only just beginning. Karen's plan to sneak extension cords across her neighbor's lawn fell apart almost instantly and spectacularly. It was Mrs. Vargas who spotted her first. A firecracker of a woman well into her 70s, Mrs. Vargas had spent years suffering under Karen's petty rule. Fined for hosting her granddaughter's birthday party without appropriate signage. Fined again when a stray beach umbrella had been left on her porch too long. Mrs. Vargas had accumulated a burning resentment that now had the perfect outlet. She stormed out onto her front steps like a thundercloud in sandals, her voice slicing through the heavy air like a whip. "Karen, get those cords off my lawn before I call the cops for trespassing." Karen, hunched over and wrestling with a tangle of cables, looked up with a furious glare. "I have a right to power. It's an emergency." Mrs. Vargas crossed her arms, unimpressed. "The only emergency here is your bad attitude." Her voice rose in volume. "You sabotage people. You destroy private property. And now you want to leech off the very people you've bullied for years. Not today. Segura. Not ever." Neighbors peered out from windows and doorways, drawn by the commotion. Nolan stood, arms folded, watching the drama unfold like a front-row spectator at the most satisfying play he'd ever seen. Even Mr. Templeton abandoned his lawn chair to saunter closer, arms dangling loosely at his sides, his whole posture radiating amused curiosity. Karen yanked her cords back furiously, her face a sunburned mask of frustration and humiliation. As she stomped back toward her house, dragging the heavy coals like defeated battle standards, a low ripple of chuckles moved through the watching neighbors. Not cruel laughter, not quite, but the kind of exhausted, cathartic release that comes after too many years of suffering in silence. But Karen's meltdown wasn't over. A short time later, she reappeared, now dragging a different cord, this one aimed at the nearest public utility pole. Her frantic attempts to tap into a city-owned light post were nothing short of ridiculous. She wrestled with the wires, her pastel sundress darkened by sweat, muttering curses under her breath. Tony Alvarez, Nolan's easygoing neighbor from 3 houses down, couldn't resist snapping a picture. He sent it to Nolan with the caption, "Is this even legal? Asking for a friend." Nolan's reply was immediate. "Not even close. Watch the fireworks." Sure enough, an hour later, a city maintenance truck rumbled onto the street. 2 workers climbed out, their bemused expressions darkening as they took in the sight of Karen frantically trying to splice into municipal wiring. The senior crewman, clipboard in hand, approached her with the exhausted patience of a man who had seen everything and hated most of it. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "you need to stop immediately or face a fine of up to $5,000 for tampering with public utilities." Karen shrieked about needing emergency power, about conspiracies, about illegal activities, but the maintenance workers didn't even argue. They just documented the scene, issued a formal warning, and left her standing alone once more, covered in sweat and self-inflicted defeat. From his porch, Nolan chuckled quietly and took another sip of his iced coffee. He could have ended it there, restored her power, made peace. But he wasn't here for peace. He was here for justice. And the day was still young. As the afternoon sun baked Driftwood Shores into a shimmering mirage, Nolan sat on his back deck, fidgeting with an idea that had been growing in his mind all morning. Watching Karen's repeated, humiliating failures had been satisfying, but he knew this war wasn't just about punishing her. It was about reclaiming the community she had suffocated for years. It was about reminding everyone what it felt like to live without fear of fines, threats, or nitpicky citations. It was time to turn his quiet rebellion into a full-blown celebration. Nolan pulled out his phone, tapped out a few texts, and within an hour, the plan was in motion. Driftwood Shores was about to have its first-ever neighborhood energy bash, an impromptu block party fueled entirely by Nolan's mini power grid. Flyers, hastily printed on Nolan's old inkjet printer, fluttered onto doorsteps and were tucked under doormats. Beat the heat. Backyard energy bash at Nolan's place, 6 p.m. Cool drinks, hot food, good vibes. Bring your own chairs. As neighbors received their invitations, curiosity bloomed like wildfire. The old Driftwood Shores had been a place where people hid behind drawn curtains, wary of attracting Karen's disapproval. Now, they practically sprinted to RSVP in person, grinning like kids let out of detention. By 6 o'clock, Nolan's backyard had transformed into a living, breathing miracle. Coolers brimmed with ice-cold sodas and beer. Tony brought his Bluetooth speakers, filling the air with classic rock. Hisses. Vargas showed up with a tray of homemade empanadas so large it could feed the entire block twice. Kids raced her on the grass with glow sticks and water guns. Lawn chairs and picnic blankets dotted the lawn, and someone even managed to borrow a giant misting fan from the local fire station to keep the air cool. String lights, rigged up along fences and pergolas, flickered to life as dusk fell, all powered by Nolan's system, running clean and strong. And looming dark and silent in the background was Karen's house, a brooding, powerless monument to everything the neighborhood had left behind. Halfway through the evening, Karen made her move. She stormed onto her porch, still dripping with sweat, clutching a clipboard like a weapon. Her voice cut across the cheerful din. "This gathering is unauthorized," she screeched. "You are all in violation of HOA regulations. Disband immediately or face penalties." For a moment, the party quieted. Heads turned. Nolan, standing by the grill flipping burgers, calmly set down his spatula. He wiped his hands on a towel, strolled to the edge of his yard, and with a casual grin, called out, "Karen, you're welcome to join us. We've got plenty of shade, lemonade, and freedom. Just leave the bolt cutters at home." A beat of stunned silence and then an eruption of laughter. Neighbors raised red Solo cups in a mocking, gleeful toast to Karen's powerless outrage. Even the kids who didn't fully understand what was happening sensed it was something worth celebrating. Karen stood frozen on her porch, her face twisted into an expression of impotent fury. Then, with a strangled shriek, she slammed her front door so hard it rattled the sagging awnings above her. The energy bash continued late into the evening, the music and laughter rising like a joyful anthem over the rooftops. Nolan watched it all from his deck, heart swelling with something far sweeter than vengeance. For the first time in years, Driftwood Shores wasn't just surviving Karen's tyranny. They were dancing on its grave. The morning after the energy bash felt like waking up to a new Driftwood Shores. The street buzzed with life. Neighbors waved at each other like old friends. Lawn chairs, once used for hiding during Karen's reign, now dotted front yards, as people lingered over morning coffee and chatted about the night's festivities. Children chased each other with bubbles and water balloons, and the whole block seemed lighter, freer, as if a weight had finally lifted. But if anyone thought Karen would slink away quietly into her powerless house and lick her wounds, they underestimated the depth of her bitterness. By noon, flyers started appearing on every doorstep, fluttering in the humid coastal breeze like unwanted invitations to doom. Nolan picked one up and nearly laughed out loud. In bold, capital letters, it read, "Emergency HOA meeting. Mandatory attendance required. Agenda, illegal energy distribution, and unauthorized community gatherings. Penalties for non-compliance will be considered." It was pure, vintage Karen barking orders from a soapbox no one respected anymore. But Nolan saw the real danger. Karen wasn't just wounded, she was cornered. And a cornered tyrant was unpredictable. At exactly 6 o'clock, under a sun still blazing furiously over Driftwood Shores, Karen set up a sad little official table in her driveway. It was a folding card table, sagging under the weight of a battered HOA binder covered in faded property compliance stickers. She stood behind it wearing a crumpled blazer, the once pristine fabric now wrinkled and stained with sweat, a clipboard clutched like a shield. A handful of neighbors drifted over, not out of loyalty, but for the spectacle. They came armed with cold drinks, shaded by giant straw hats, and wearing expressions of thinly veiled amusement. Karen wasted no time. She launched into a breathless, furious tirade, accusing Nolan of violating HOA energy regulations, claiming the block party endangered public safety, and insisting that the HOA must take swift, harsh action. Nolan stood quietly at the back of the crowd, arms folded, letting her dig her grave. When Karen finally paused to catch her breath, face red, hair plastered to her forehead, Nolan stepped forward, silent as a knife. From under his arm, he pulled a neat stack of papers. Signed consent forms from every participating neighbor. Copies of city ordinances supporting private solar grids and emergency energy sharing. An official email from a city official thanking him for reducing strain on the power infrastructure. Nolan handed the papers to the nearest neighbor, who began reading aloud, his voice dripping with satisfaction. One by one, the pages passed through the crowd, each new revelation draining the color from Karen's face a little more. Mrs. Vargas, seated proudly in a lawn chair she had planted dead center in Karen's driveway, produced a megaphone from somewhere no one knew where and bellowed. "I move to have Karen removed as HOA president immediately for gross misconduct and community endangerment." The crowd roared in approval, laughing and clapping. Someone pulled out an old recycling bin to serve as a makeshift ballot box. Slips of paper appeared out of nowhere, ballots scribbled with decisive X's and names. Votes were tallied swiftly, right there under the brutal sun. The final count. Karen, 2 votes, and Nolan was pretty sure one of them came from her dog. Nolan, unanimously appointed Emergency Utilities Coordinator, a brand new role invented on the spot, legitimized by overwhelming community consensus. Karen stood there trembling, words caught in her throat, watching everything she had built crumble into dust at her sandaled feet. Her clipboard slipped from her hands and clattered to the concrete. No one even glanced at it. They were too busy cheering the dawn of a new Driftwood Shores. For a few blissful days after the emergency whole meeting, it seemed like Driftwood Shores had finally turned the page. The atmosphere was electric with optimism, and not just from Nolan's grid. Plans buzzed from porch to porch about block parties, community gardens, shared tool sheds, and a future free from Karen's stranglehold. But peace, it turned out, was not enough for Karen. Late one sweltering Saturday afternoon, as Nolan and Tony were sketching plans for a permanent battery hub in Nolan's garage, Tony's phone buzzed. His eyes widened as he stared at the photo sent by a neighbor and wordlessly passed the screen to Nolan. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Karen, in a crumpled sundress, hair wild, was crouched behind her house with a shady-looking electrician. Coils of heavy black cable snaked through the dirt, and a battered power tool gleamed in the sunlight. They weren't repairing anything. They were illegally tapping into the newly built private energy lines that Nolan and the neighborhood had painstakingly set up. Nolan's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a petty tantrum. This wasn't an embarrassing public outburst. This was sabotage. Without hesitation, Nolan dialed the police. Calmly, methodically, he explained the situation, emphasizing the legality of tampering with private utility systems, especially during an ongoing heatwave emergency. Within 15 minutes, a pair of patrol cars rolled quietly onto the street. From behind the shade of his porch, Nolan watched as officers approached Karen and the stunned electrician. Heated words flew, Karen's arms slashing the air in wild, angry gestures. She pointed at Nolan's house, at the solar tower, at the neighbors peering out their windows. She said it was just a simple reconnection. The electrician stammered, horrified when he realized how deep he was in. She said it was her grid. The officers weren't impressed. Tampering with energy systems was serious business. Dangerous business. The risk of fires, electrocution, even citywide outages was real. And Karen, blinded by spite, hadn't cared. While the officers questioned her, Karen grew shriller, more desperate. She tried to invoke her position as HOA president, forgetting, perhaps, that she no longer held that title. She screamed about conspiracies, claimed victimhood, demanded that they arrest Nolan instead. The officers, thoroughly unimpressed, finally escorted Karen to the back of the patrol car. She wasn't handcuffed yet, but the unspoken message was clear. She was facing criminal charges now. Neighbors gathered quietly, murmuring in small, stunned clusters. Phones clicked as photos were taken, not out of cruelty, but to document the surreal, inevitable fall of the tyrant who had made their lives miserable for so long. Nolan watched, arms folded, heart pounding with a cold, fierce satisfaction. Karen hadn't just lost her throne. She had detonated it and herself for all to see. And Nolan knew this wasn't the end of her reckoning. The community had finally found its voice, and they weren't going to be silenced again. The police may have driven Karen away that afternoon, but in Nolan's mind and in the minds of every neighbor watching, the real battle wasn't over. Not yet. In the cool dusk that followed Karen's dramatic removal, Nolan convened a small gathering on his back deck. Tony, Mrs. Vargas, Mr. Templeton, and a few others. They weren't there to gloat. They were there to protect what they had built and to ensure Driftwood Shores would never again fall under the thumb of a petty tyrant. The decision came swiftly and unanimously. They would file a civil lawsuit against Karen. Not out of spite, though no one would deny there was a certain satisfaction in the idea, but out of necessity. Karen's sabotage had risked lives during a declared heatwave emergency. She had tampered with private property, endangered the fragile solar network Nolan had worked so hard to create, and left a documented trail of vandalism and criminal mischief. The lawsuit was about setting a precedent. In Driftwood Shores, sabotage had consequences. With Nolan coordinating the effort, the neighbors gathered evidence in record time. Security footage of Karen cutting Nolan's original power line, photos of her attempting to tap into the new private grid, statements from residents she had harassed or fined under false pretenses, copies of the police report detailing her illegal activity. No one, not even Karen's few former allies, came to her defense. When the court papers were served at Karen's house, she reacted exactly as Nolan had expected, a screeching tantrum visible and audible halfway down the block. But her protests were empty now, her threats hollow. The legal wheels turned fast. Karen, faced with overwhelming evidence and a mountain of legal fees, crumbled quickly. Within weeks, she agreed to a crushing settlement. She would pay substantial damages to the neighborhood association and to Nolan personally for property destruction, tampering, and emotional distress caused during the heat wave. There was one problem for Karen. She didn't have that kind of money lying around. And so, the final nail slid effortlessly into the coffin of her reign. Karen was forced to sell her beloved Victorian house. The sight of the for sale sign hammered into her manicured front lawn was almost poetic. Neighbors who had once feared her fines now walked past her property openly, smiling, laughing, living. Karen, trapped inside her dark, sweltering house, occasionally peeked from behind the blinds, watching the world move on without her. Nolan didn't feel cruelty toward her, just a deep, satisfying peace. It hadn't been about revenge in the end. It had been about restoring balance, freedom, and dignity to a community that had lived under a dictatorship of pettiness for far too long. As the moving trucks finally rumbled down Driftwood Shores, the neighbors gathered not for a mocking send-off, but for a quiet celebration of their hard-won independence. Karen was gone, and for the first time in years, Driftwood Shores truly belonged to the people who loved it. The day Karen finally left Driftwood Shores felt like the sun itself was smiling down on the neighborhood. Her moving truck, stuffed to the brim with floral couches, resting patio furniture, and a sad pile of HOA binders, rolled down the coastal road and disappeared without fanfare. No one waved. No one shouted good riddance. No one needed to. Instead, a ripple of celebration passed quietly through the streets. It wasn't loud or cruel, it was the sweet, simple relief of people finally breathing free air again. That night, without any formal announcement, the entire block seemed to come alive. Children zipped down the sidewalks on bicycles festooned with fairy lights. Families hauled grills and folding tables out to front yards. Old Mr. Templeton set up a rickety boombox that screeched out 80s hits, and no one complained about the noise. Nolan walked the block slowly, taking it all in. The smiles, the laughter, the simple conversations over fences that had once felt like battle lines. Mrs. Vargas proudly tended to a sprawling new flowerbed, vibrant and wild, defiantly beautiful in a way that Karen would have fined her for in a heartbeat. Tony and his wife finally installed the vivid blue porch swing they'd dreamed about for years. Even the usually gruff Mr. Becker at the end of the street had strung a row of twinkling lights across his fence, joining in the impromptu festival. At the park, neighbors were already sketching out plans for bigger things: a shared community garden, an open-air movie night powered by the new solar grid, a tool library to help anyone who needed a little extra support. Driftwood Shores wasn't just surviving without Karen. It was thriving. It was as if the community had shed a heavy, invisible chain, one that they hadn't even realized had been dragging them down all those years. Now, they stood taller, laughed louder, lived fuller. And at the heart of it all stood Nolan, not as a leader demanding obedience, but as the quiet architect of freedom, the neighbor who had refused to be cowed, the man who had dared to believe Driftwood Shores could be better. Sitting on his porch with a cold beer, Nolan watched the sunset melt into the ocean horizon, feeling a profound, bone-deep peace he hadn't felt in years. They had built something stronger than walls or fences. They had built trust. They had built a community. And as he watched the lights flicker to life, clean, independent, unstoppable, Nolan knew this was only the beginning. The best days of Driftwood Shores still lay ahead. In the weeks following Karen's departure, Driftwood Shores underwent a transformation so profound it felt almost magical. The energy that had once been spent tiptoeing around petty rules was now channeled into creation. Nolan, never one to rest for long, proposed one final project to secure their newfound independence: a permanent solar tower in the heart of their little coastal community. Not just panels slapped onto rooftops, but a true beacon, a tall, graceful structure that could power the entire street in emergencies, provide free lighting for the park, and serve as a permanent symbol that Driftwood Shores belonged to its people now, not to any HOA tyrant. The community rallied behind the idea with an enthusiasm that stunned even Nolan. Donations flooded in, not just money, but time, materials, elbow grease. Retired electricians volunteered to help with wiring. Teens from the local high school pitched in to dig foundation holes and set up scaffolding. Even Mr. Templeton showed up every morning with a battered thermos full of coffee and a stubborn insistence on supervising everything. Piece by piece, the tower rose. Steel supports glinted under the sun. Panels unfolded like shimmering leaves, catching the ocean breeze and the endless blue sky. When the day of the unveiling finally arrived, the entire neighborhood gathered in the park under a brilliant, cloudless sky. There were no politicians, no reporters, just neighbors, folding chairs, homemade potluck dishes, and the hum of excitement. Tony acted as the unofficial MC, his booming voice carrying over the crowd. He called Nolan up to the makeshift stage, a stack of pallets draped with a beach towel, and handed him a plaque. Nolan peeled back the covering to reveal the words engraved in brass: "Light over pettiness in memory of the great Driftwood Shores blackout." The laughter and cheers that erupted were full and real and heartfelt. Nolan, a little overwhelmed, simply smiled and lifted the plaque high above his head. He walked to the base of the tower and fastened it into place with a heavy, satisfying clink. Then, with a nod from Tony, Nolan threw the main switch. The tower came alive. Soft lights bathed the park in a warm, welcoming glow. Pathways sparkled. The playground shimmered under gentle spotlights. Children squealed and darted into the illuminated grass, playing long after the sun had sunk into the sea. It was beautiful. It was theirs. And somewhere far away, Karen, wherever she had landed, would never dim this light. Nolan wandered through the gathering, exchanging hugs, slaps on the back, and toasts of lemonade and beer. Later that night, long after the crowd had dispersed and the only sounds were the crash of the waves and the soft buzz of the solar lights, Nolan stood alone under the tower, gazing up at the stars. He thought about how it had all started with one act of sabotage born of pettiness, and how it had led, improbably, to this, a community stronger, freer, and more united than ever before. Sometimes, he realized, it takes a little darkness to make you build your own light. And standing there under the tower they had built together, Nolan knew with absolute certainty, Driftwood Shores would never be in the dark again. In every community, there will always be voices that cling to control, fueled by fear, bitterness, or a desperate need for power. It's easy to be intimidated, to stay silent, to let small injustices pile up until they become a prison you can't even see. But this story reminds us that real strength isn't found in confrontation alone, it's found in creation. When faced with sabotage, Nolan didn't respond with anger or destruction. He built something better. He turned pettiness into unity. He turned isolation into community. He turned darkness into light, literally and figuratively. The lesson is simple but powerful. When someone tries to tear you down out of spite, don't just survive, thrive. Don't fight fire with fire. Fight it by building something so bright, so undeniable, that their bitterness burns itself out. True leadership isn't about winning arguments or clinging to titles. It's about inspiring others to stand taller, live freer, and believe in a better way forward. And the most lasting victories aren't the ones shouted from rooftops, they're the ones that quietly transform lives, neighborhoods, and futures for the better. When faced with small-minded cruelty, remember, the best revenge is not destruction. It's building a life, a home, and a community that shines so brightly it makes the darkness irrelevant.